Hey everyone, welcome to the lecture on Victorian supernatural fiction. This week we're going to be looking at three different short stories from the 19th century that all have to do with some sort of supernatural occurrence within the text. And because we're looking at three different stories, what you're going to find is that this lecture is a little bit longer than the normal ones. I encourage you to come back to it. You can pause it, you can revisit it. Don't feel like you have to sit down and listen to it all at once. It'll probably be more helpful if you go through story by story and think about each one and then revisit the lecture as you're going through each story. So just keep that in mind. We're going to be starting out by looking at a couple of traditional ghost stories from the Victorian era. So I wanted to give you a little bit of historical context. First of all, the tradition of ghost stories in British literature really stretches back to the 16th century when they were called winter tales. These tales were told during the winter time because of the winter solstice, which is the shortest day of the year. Essentially, what happens is there's a celebration of the death of light because light is going away, becoming the shortest time during the year when light is not present, followed by the movement towards the rebirth of light the next day after the winter solstice when days start to become longer again. So that winter solstice time was considered to be a time when ghosts may walk the earth, when there's not the least amount of light, the least amount of spiritual light as well on the earth, and where this would be a more opportune time for ghosts to visit. Because Christmas was placed on the calendar in the winter, a lot of times the solstice and Christmas Eve might be close in time. Christmas Eve then also became celebrated as a time when ghosts could walk the earth to settle unfinished business. And I know we're not usually used to associating Christmas with the visitation of ghosts and ghost stories, but this is actually something that became traditional in literature and even in oral traditions and really continued to be present into the 19th century. In the 19th century, ghost stories moved from being something that were just celebrated and told perhaps among family side gatherings or at holiday parties into something that actually was marketable and became part of business because of the increase in literacy and the Industrial Revolution, which led to cheaper printing materials because people were able to distribute printing materials more widely, and stories were more readily published and available to everyday readers. So when you think about things like 19th century literary texts that are entertaining for readers, things like sensation novels, detective fiction, which we've talked about, all of these things are popular and widely circulated, and ghost stories began to also be printed and circulated during the Victorian time period. Christmas ghost stories in particular were published in periodicals or journals, especially by Charles Dickens, and then collected into anthologies. So, of course, the most famous one being The Christmas Carol, with the story of Scrooge being visited by ghosts on Christmas Eve. So combining all of these things that I've been talking about so far, a tale that has a moral, an occurrence that happens on Christmas, but it involves ghosts because that is one of the days of the year, the winter solstice being a time when ghosts might be able to visit someone. So this was a very popular type of genre of story that would be really entertaining. And a reference today that you can still hear that carries over from this idea of ghost stories on Christmas is in the Christmas Carol, It's the Most Wonderful Time of the Year. And I have the verse there for you. There'll be scary ghost stories and tales of the glories of Christmases long, long ago. And this is the most wonderful time of the year. It's Christmas time, and it's time to tell ghost stories. So if you've never noticed that line, that's why that line is there. It's because traditionally in literary history, ghost stories were told at Christmas time because of its connection to the winter solstice. So this should give you some historical context for the different stories that we're going to be reading and really why they were important or interesting to people in the 19th century. Now, before we get into our specific stories for this week, I want to talk a little bit about the work of the ghost and how the ghost functions narratively within different literary texts. So if you aren't as familiar with the Christmas Carol by Charles Dickens, there are a couple of movies out there about it already. It's been adapted a lot. I encourage you to just look up a quick summary of that. That is just for you so that you can know that that's the most famous Christmas ghost story. It was published at Christmas time. It was specifically drawing on this idea of the ghost. And I want to use that as a background just so we can talk about some of the things that the ghost may do within that particular text, but then what it can also do in lots of different ghost stories. So one of the things that a ghost does is relieve anxiety because it gives explanations for something that might be unknown for readers. It can also represent problems of the human condition like guilt or shame. So in the case of A Christmas Carol, if you remember the story, Scrooge goes to sleep and he's known for being really miserly, and he has these visions of different ghosts, the ghosts of Christmas past, present, and future, that are trying to help him understand what he's doing with his life and how he needs to change. So in the case of anxiety, there could be some latent guilt that Scrooge is experiencing, and the ghost is that manifestation of that. It helps to be able to have in a narrative a physical focus or target or symbol of what someone is dealing with emotionally or psychologically within the story. The ghost also acts as an outsider, providing perspective. So in Scrooge's case, it helps us understand him better because the ghost gives us a way to look at Scrooge and to understand his behavior in three different ways: in the past, in the present, and then in the future. So it helps us to move through time with him and think about his behaviors and his actions and his attitudes without us having a narrator tell us about that. It also gives moral commentary. In the case of A Christmas Carol, Scrooge is learning a lesson. The purpose of the ghosts visiting him are to change him and to help him understand the way that his behavior and his attitude is affecting other people. So the moral commentary there is really intentional by Charles Dickens because he's trying to use the ghost to also teach his readers these same types of lessons. Often the ghost also relates to social class. Usually ghost stories would have been considered a lower type of literature, not this high educated, refined literature, but one associated with lower classes, less educated people who would feel like these ghost stories are possibly true without any evidence and would just believe it and take it and become more credulous about it, not seeing it as symbolic, but seeing it as a literal story. So typically that was the stigma of ghost stories, is that it would be associated with a particularly lower social class rather than the more educated upper class. So when you see a ghost appear in a 19th century text, these are usually some of the ways that it's going to be working or functioning, either symbolically, giving sort of vent to anxiety, providing outside perspectives, giving moral commentary, or perhaps making a commentary about class as well. When we think about the ghost story in terms of its narrative structure, what we will see is that most often ghost stories do not have an uncanny explanation. You'll remember that uncanny means realistic, or it's going to work out something in terms of suspense to where there's a factual, obvious answer that's grounded in truth. In ghost stories, this is not going to be the case. We're fully in the realm of the truly marvelous, the truly supernatural. We don't have to guess about what is real or make a decision as readers, because typically what happens in these stories is the characters accept that the ghosts are real, or as we'll see in The Mark of the Beast, that the supernatural is real. So whether it's a ghost directly identifying itself as a ghost, whether it's more mysterious and something like the Signalman, or whether it's maybe even not a ghost at all and just a supernatural occurrence, whatever the case is, you're always going to be seeing this type of story not resolving into the uncanny. It is fully marvelous. The suspense is not going to come from hesitation. There's not going to be a mystery to solve. Essentially, what it does is raise questions for readers, and it gives pleasure in a different way than an uncanny story might. So one of the things we're going to be looking at this week is, how does the ghost story create pleasure for readers? How much willing suspension of disbelief does it take for us to enjoy the story? Can we turn off that need for the realist, truth-based, evidence-based answer to the story and enjoy what the ghost symbolizes or what the ghost is trying to teach? It's also important for us to remember that a lot of times these ghost stories are going to rely on isolation. Sometimes the setting can be very cliche. Sometimes it's physical isolation that represents a more symbolic isolation, Or it could be that the ghost is coming into town, just like with Scrooge, and interrupting his daily life, and there's not physical isolation, but it's much more about pulling him out of time, right? And he's going from past to present to future and isolating him from the day-to-day activities that everyone else is doing within the time stream. So there's different ways that the narrative will work on readers and ask different things of you, but essentially the ghost story is always going to be fully marvelous, fully supernatural, and not asking you to find any sort of realistic explanation for its presence. So let's move now into the first story that I asked you to read, the Old Nurse's Story. This story was published in 1852 in a Christmas issue of Household Words, which was Charles Dickens's journal. So Gaskell, who wrote it, Elizabeth Gaskell, who wrote the story, is good friends with Charles Dickens, and she actually would publish frequently in his journal. And she was primarily known for more realistic fiction. But because Victorian ghost stories were so popular and commercially marketable, a lot of Victorian authors would publish these short ghost stories in periodicals like Dickens's, just as a way to make a little bit of extra money because they knew that they would sell and that they were very popular and that people liked them. So Gaskell published the Old Nurse's Story as part of that Christmas ghost story tradition that I've been talking about. When we're looking at a story that was published for commercial reasons, we can also ask ourselves what kind of cultural work that particular story was doing. So obviously, Gaskell, as the author, was publishing it because she wanted to make money, and Dickens was publishing it because he knew it would sell. But we can also think about the cultural work that was being done in the historical moment of the Victorian time period where people were reading it. This opens up ways for us to think about what the story's relevance can be for us as readers today, even though we're removed from that commercial, immediate experience of its publication. So I want to draw your attention to a few different points within the story just to get you thinking about this idea of cultural work, which I'm also going to touch on a little bit later as well. Basically, the first thing to think about is the social class background of the story, both in the position of the narrator as well as Maud's inappropriate marriage. So remember that the narrator is the old nurse, and she's been with the family a long time, and she's in the servant class. She's the one that's telling the story and controlling the story. And Dorothy and James, who are also of the working class, they're at Furnivall Manor. They are also within her same social class. So while we have this kind of cast of characters that extending from the upper class with the Furnivalls, we also are getting the perspective of the lower class as well. And you'll notice pretty quickly that what happens is that the middle to lower class characters are considered to be the nice characters, while the upper class characters are proud and eventually, as we find out, responsible for a child's death. So within this class system, we're being shown a type of moral lesson here. But who is this lesson supposed to be for? So if we think of it in terms of what would be most entertaining for historical readers, the rising middle class would have been the primary readers of the story, with the lower classes as well probably hearing it read, or in many cases by late Victorian era, you have universal literacy, so we're really talking about everybody can have access to this and read it. So upper class characters are convenient villains here because they're not going to be the ones reading this story. So it's easy to project them as being outside of that familiar circle of storytelling where the people who are most reassured by the story are the ones in the social class that's actually reading it. When we're thinking about the actual crime that happens, you can even see that social class of the upper class villains being divided further apart from Maud with her decision to marry outside of her social class, contrasted with her punishment, which is to be turned out of her own home and banished from her family, which ultimately results in her child's death. So Maud is not really the villain here. The focus is really on Lord Furnivall and on Grace, the people who throw her out, the ones that are really condemned by the story's action and are condemned to be ghosts and sort of repeat this, as we say at the end, repeat the banishment of Maud and the knowingness of Grace, seeing this happen over and over again through the ghosts, and then eventually becoming part of that story, this inescapable repetition of the ghosts action. The greatest sin that we see here is the rejection of family. So I want you to think about that as well. Like, what is the ghost story actually teaching or pointing towards in terms of the lesson? Because the lesson gets really clear and really strict at the conclusion of the story. We see Maud's behavior in rejecting the proper behavior of a woman to approach her father, to have an honorable marriage that's not in secret, and she's thrown out for this. Sadly, this is not really that uncommon in terms of the way people might react to a secret marriage and a secret child, that there would be this familial rejection. Perhaps not in the middle of a snowstorm leading to a child's death, of course, but there would have been societal expectations on women in particular. So this tale, again, if we think of it in terms of the work that it's doing, probably directed more particularly to women, to young women, who might be entertaining romantic hopes with the drawing master, and this might be a little cautionary tale, somewhat of a warning that the way that they're acting may actually lead them into being rejected by their family. So I want you to think of it as being both entertaining and something that's selling and commercially marketable, but also in its own way performing this cultural work of reinforcing certain Victorian mores or morals that are important within society. What we're going to see as we go on this semester is that Victorian fantasy in particular frequently uses a moral lesson to try to direct readers to the purpose of the supernatural in a story. I'm going to talk about that more extensively later. But basically, in this case, what they have at the conclusion, what Gaskell has written in, is an overt moral lesson. You have this climatic supernatural scene that's really, bringing together all the mystery and unveiling what's happened and why the ghost girl is at the door trying to get the Rosamond to come out into the snow. And you see this dramatic staging of the rejection of Maud and her child. And then you end with Grace repeating, "What is done in youth can never be undone in old age," in this kind of fit that she falls into and never recovers from. So this moral lesson is applying, of course, both to Maud's choice to marry secretly and to Grace's choice to be part of throwing her sister out, but also it is really telling readers, here's what to do with this fantasy. If you have been entertained by the ghost story, great, but it's not just a ghost story. It has a point to it, right? It's trying to teach something and to take that fantasy out of just the supernatural realm and put it into the realistic everyday world so that it makes sense and has some kind of application. And in this case, the lesson is that there's no forgiveness and no changing the past. And we could speculate that, none of the things in the story would have happened if Maud had not married beneath her social class. So again, re-emphasizing this issue of class, and that if the classes don't mix, then there's really no tragedy that happens. If Maud had done the right thing, even though she's not the villain, there would have been no dead child, there would have been no ghosts, everything would have gone on perfectly fine. So really the moral lesson is there's no room for error in how you live your life. That sort of scare of the ghost is really mirroring the scariness or the starkness of the moral. Because in some ways, I think it's a little terrifying to think that you can really never escape your mistakes. That if you do something, that it's going to follow you from your youth all the way into your old age, and that there will be no forgiveness and no redemption and nothing you can do about it. It's easy to laugh it off because it's a ghost story and we can just, close the newspaper and the case of Dickens and say, oh, that was a very entertaining story. But really underneath that anxiety that the ghost is provoking is doing the cultural work of really confirming a type of status quo there. Really in kind of directing the middle class female reader to think about the choices that she's making and to try to avoid the fate that Maud and Grace end up facing. So the last thing that I want to note about this story before we move on to the Signalman is to remember that it does have a frame. The narrator, the old nurse, is telling this story to Rosamond's child. So you'll remember Rosamond is the little girl in the story that sees the ghost girl out the window and goes out into the snow and tries to follow her and almost dies. That's Rosamond. So at the time of the story's telling, Rosamond has grown up. She's become a mother herself. The nurse has stayed in the family and is now caring for her daughter. So she's telling the story as kind of a flashback to when she was herself younger and when Rosamond was just a child. So sharing this story in that context, of course, is very likely to scare the child. You can imagine if there's this older nurse living with the family who's suddenly telling you stories about your mom almost dying in a snowstorm because of ghosts. This is going to be really scary for a young child, even more so than for an adult reader. It also, though, is implying to Victorian readers that children need this type of scary moral instruction. So it's entertaining on one level, just if we're reading it as an adult. But if you're thinking of what kind of cultural work this story could do, I want you also to think about the purpose of audience, right? And what's happening. Gaskell really didn't have to have that story told from this point of view in order to tell the story. It could have easily not had this sort of frame narrative device where it's being told to a child, but it does. And I think that that's an intentional choice so that we can think about the way that children are being educated through the use of societal expectations combined with this issue of the supernatural or fantasy. So how those two things are working together to kind of control and define parameters starting out in childhood and then moving into the adult readers who would also get a very similar type of lesson from the story. So keep these things in mind as you're reading even small stories, that cultural work is a big part of the way that short stories like this were functioning, even though they were maybe not published for societal change or for trying to enact justice like a lot more realistic literature is. Let's take a look now at The Signalman by Charles Dickens. This story was published in 1866, also as a Christmas tale, this time in All the Year Round. Dickens himself was involved in a railway accident the year before he wrote this story, and he draws on some of his own experiences and his own memories, as well as his own anxiety when he's writing this story. And he references actual accidents in this story. So the first train crash that you read about is based on a true story, basically. You could think of it that way. So he's blending realism with the supernatural in this story. And I want to point that out because I want you to pay attention to the way that even though people are still using the supernatural in their stories, in this one and as we'll see in The Mark of the Beast, you're having some flexibility in how much supernaturalism is present in the story. So all three of these that we're looking at this week are taking place in the real world, and there's these ghostly intersections that are happening, or in the case of The Mark of the Beast, supernaturalness that isn't necessarily ghost related, but still this kind of intervention of the supernatural into the everyday. And authors are really looking at the way that the supernatural affects the real. What do we do with it? How does it work? What are the possibilities for it? So it's not that we're necessarily fully in fantasy at this point where we're in Wonderland in the case of something like Lewis Carroll, which we'll be reading later. But we're still in the everyday. We're just looking at what happens when the supernatural intersects with the real. And what do we do with that? So that's kind of the context, particularly for The Signalman and then for The Mark of the Beast as we're moving forward. As you read The Signalman, what you may have noticed is that Dickens is subverting the traditional ghost story in a variety of ways. I'm going to talk about those here in a moment, but I want to pull out some of the parallels between he and Gaskell's story. What you'll see at the beginning is that social class is still a background to this story, just as it was in the old nurse's story. The signalman himself discusses how he's kind of wasted his opportunities and has had to take a job below his educational abilities. And the narrator mentions this a couple of times, that he feels like that man is someone that is doing an excellent job, but has perhaps through the isolation of the job begun to have his mind turned towards madness. He doesn't say that overtly, but he's kind of hoping that he'll go see a doctor and that he can help this man overcome what he sees as being hallucinations or some kind of neurological problem. So the narrator's kind of trying to persuade the signalman of these uncanny interpretations of his experiences through coincidence, through neurology, these different things. And he doesn't really believe in the presence, the narrator doesn't believe in the presence of the ghosts himself. But that social class background is there. It's an upper class man who's interacted with somebody who's in a working class job, but recognizes him as being better than the job that he's in. So this social class background, again, is teaching a little bit of a moral lesson here, although I don't think that that's Dickens's point in the same way that Gaskell's was. So we could apply a lesson of, oh, this man has fallen from his station into a worse job because he ran wild, as he said, and he wasted his opportunities, and now he has to take a job below his educational abilities, and maybe there's a moral lesson there. But this particular story is not really going to give us that closure and that simplicity in the same way that Gaskell's did. So you'll see this ambiguity that is running throughout the story, and that this is part of the anxiety that the story is really trying to tap into. And what we have here is a story that's really questioning the purpose of the presence of the ghosts. And you hear that in the actual narrative of the signalman. He's asking these questions. Why not tell me why you're there, right? He has this feeling of powerlessness because the ghost appears and it's, in some ways foretelling, as we learn later, his own death, but we don't really know that at the time, and he doesn't know that. It's just a source of confusion. And he's saying, if I'm getting these ghostly appearances, why aren't they saying something that would be useful for me so that I could actually change the situation? So there's this warning that's given, but there's no actual knowledge or way to apply it. So again, what we see is that the signalman is looking for a way to take the supernatural and turn it into a moral lesson, but there is no moral for him to cling to. So in that way, Dickens is also doing the same thing with his overall story. He's taking the expectations that readers would have about ghost stories, that there should be some kind of moral or purpose, and he's saying, actually, I'm not going to give you that simple answer either. I'm going to let you rest in that state of ambiguity and in that state of feeling that there's nothing you can do about it, and that can actually heighten a sense of anxiety about what the ghost story is doing, rather than providing that closure that we saw at the end of Gaskell's. So as the narrator is describing his encounter with the signalman, there's one particular sentence that he uses that I think is really intriguing or interesting for us to think about in terms of possible cultural work for this particular story. And the sentence is, "It was the mental torture of a conscientious man, oppressed beyond endurance by an unintelligible responsibility involving life." So I'm kind of pulling that phrase out of the context of the story, and I want you to think about that. The torture, the mental torture that the signalman is undergoing, is someone who's trying to do a good job, someone who's maybe fallen down in life, is working hard, trying to fulfill all the responsibilities, but has become oppressed by this feeling of not knowing what to do, by having this feeling of feeling responsible, feeling that there are things that are supposed to be done, but is confused about how to enact them for any sort of real change, that there's this responsibility for life, but he doesn't really know how he's supposed to be responsible, or what he's supposed to do, or what he's supposed to say, or who he should tell. And he's afraid to speak into that situation because he could lose his job. The signalman talks about that. If I cry danger, if I make this call and they say, "Where's the danger?" and he says, "I don't know, just be careful," people will fire him because they'll think he's crazy. So it's this feeling of trying to do the right thing and being responsible and knowing that there are things that are wrong, but then not really being able to change the circumstances because of fear or because of not really knowing the best way forward. So that particular sentence, I think, is really key for what Dickens is pointing to in terms of this story, that this man is an exemplar of a lot of Victorian people who may feel like there are things that are wrong in society, but they don't really have the courage or the opportunity to speak into those situations to really make real change, because there's this system that's in place that is really constraining them and causing them a lot of anxiety, that if they speak up, that they'll be seen as outsiders and crazy, and that they could lose their situation in society or their jobs and their livelihoods, and that there's this sense of wanting to do what's right but not actually having any real sense of agency there. So underneath this, story of the man seeing the ghost is also this kind of bigger cultural commentary about someone who's really struggling and who could be seen as representative of people in Victorian society who really don't know or don't feel like they have a voice or an ability to say anything. And think about, again, the ghost's silence, right? That there's not always a voice that's coming with the ghost, and that, it weeping voicelessly, and just having that figure be representative or symbolic of someone's mental state, that they could be sad and depressed and feeling like they have no way to speak, and that there's just silence and the figure of weeping or mourning that, again, Dickens points out is often seen on tombstones, right? So there's a lot of darkness here underlying a pretty simple story if we put it in terms of how it could be representative in larger Victorian culture. And when we think about the ending, we need to really think about this issue of how there really is no closure. There is no overt moral, as I mentioned, like in the Gaskell story, and we don't even really know if the signalman's death was an accident or if it could possibly be suicide, because his friend who's come to visit him and talk to him is really concerned about his mental state and is actually coming to take him to a doctor and to a psychologist or possibly a neurologist to try to help him figure out his own mental state and how he could be protected from this sort of isolation that's overcome him. So we don't really know if the signalman has been led into suicide or if it really is just a terrible accident. So that ambiguity that rests there really resists the typical Victorian ending that's going to try to define everything and put parameters around everything and tell readers how to feel about it and what to think. Instead, you're left with this ambiguity and this restlessness and that same sense, perhaps, of not knowing what to do, just like the signalman himself. So Dickens is intentionally playing with these conventions of the ghost story and subverting them and trying to help readers feel differently about the work of the ghost than they would in a story like The Old Nurse's Tale. So we're kind of left with this open question about how we interpret events as the readers. So there's not that closure that we would necessarily expect. The narrator himself never sees the ghosts. We don't know if the ghosts are actually real or not. In The Old Nurse's story, we have for sure the ghosts are absolutely real. Everybody sees them. Everybody agrees that they're there. It's not a question at all. In this story, we're not sure. So that hesitation or that ambiguity that Todorov describes in that fantastique moment is not completely 100% resolved. We don't know if the narrator was perhaps going mad and hallucinating the ghosts, but we do know that there are these coincidences that have happened that he predicted. So somehow the supernatural has happened and we end up in the realm of the marvelous, but we're not really sure how that happened. So we don't have the same solidity, the same closure that something like The Old Nurse's story would give us. So think about these two stories as companions in some ways, because Dickens certainly knew and was publishing Gaskell's work, and then was also considering how to subvert and how to use the ghost story in a different way than maybe it had been used previously within the larger culture. We're going to move now away from a more traditional ghost story into looking at the use of the supernatural in The Mark of the Beast, which is not a ghost story, but is still invoking a marvelous type of experience that doesn't have any sort of realistic explanation for it. And it's going to be using the qualities of realism and fantasy differently than what we've seen before. Before we get into the story, I wanted to give you some historical context for it, because a lot of the symbolism of the story relies on the reader understanding what was going on in England at the time. So first of all, you should know that the British Empire was at its height of wealth and influence between the 1850s to 1880s. This is during the Victorian era, which does last until 1901, but during this 30-year period, the Victorian era was marked by a lot of confidence and a sense of superiority over other cultures and nations. Superiority really relies on these feelings of privilege that came about built by wealth, through the British sense of race, education, technological advancement, and cultural taste. The desire then was to have this secure and prosperous nation by controlling other colonial properties. And England has this colonial project of what they called bringing light to the world. They saw themselves as paternalistically bringing civilization into what they called dark corners of the world, including portions of Africa and India. So the desire then was to be able to go out and conquer and to have this sense of confidence about this project of conquering and colonialism. And with this sort of desire, essentially what underlies that is that there is this fear that they themselves could actually be invaded, that they could be taken over, that they could have this power upset, to discover then that they were not as superior as they believed, and to be colonized themselves rather than being the colonizer. So having that sense of belief about the self and the project of the British Empire overturned. And a lot of what happens then in what would be considered colonial or post-colonial literature is that sometimes this fear is reversed. Most of the time in Victorian literature, there was a big distinction between England proper and then the empire, which would be the colonies. A lot of times novels would use colonies as a place of exile. So, for example, if there was a bad quote unquote character, they would sometimes be sent out of England into a colony as a punishment. Foreign characters or locations were often fascinating for readers, but they were also typically considered inferior. So you have this sense where the text would use foreign locations or other people as a way to bring excitement or to heighten suspense. But usually there was going to be a distinction made at the end of the text between what was properly English and then what was considered other or improper. Texts, much like the reality of British politics at the time, did not often portray the colonists' viewpoints or have much sympathy for outsiders. So the actual problems of colonization, like famine and injustice and war and poverty, how England's wealth was manipulating this, or the oppression that comes through language, many things that are seen in later post-colonial writings, those things are not portrayed typically during the Victorian time period. So you have literature that is much more going to affirm the colonial project rather than critiquing it. Or if those critiques come, they're usually done in ways that are very, very subtle and could be easily overlooked. So just very briefly again, colonialism is different than the way that slavery functioned in England. Slavery by the time of the 1850s has been outlawed in England and in its territories. So it's not practiced anymore. Colonial projects are different in the sense that where perhaps they were involved in slave trade previously, now you're talking about colonial interests coming in, setting up governments, setting up political systems, educational systems, trying to take over the culture of certain situations and replace it with British culture. So some famous examples are the way that England brought in language systems and refused to let people speak in their native dialects in places like Kenya, for example, replacing native languages with English and punishing native peoples if they spoke anything other than English. So colonial systems aren't just limited to slavery and physical restraint, but it actually extends out into, once slavery is outlawed, it extends out into the political realm, the educational realm, and just really taking over, or again colonizing a particular area and trying to erase the original culture that was there. So a lot of people in England understood and accepted that this was happening. But again, there's a cultural anxiety underlying this project. There's moral questioning of what this colonial project means for other people, but it's not necessarily the strongest voice in the room, so to speak. So, what novelists do is they seize on this time where people are feeling this anxiety, but also having this great sense of superiority because it's the height of the empire, it's the height of wealth in England. There's a lot of positive things going for some people in the country, and they recognize that there's this tension, that there's this difference between the anxiety about colonialism and that feeling of superiority that other people are experiencing. So they're manipulating this tension to ask readers to think about, how would it feel to be a colonist? Are we comfortable with foreign influence if that influence is felt on ourselves? And there's this kind of underlying questioning in the literature about this kind of terror of being controlled by what's called the other. So if you're not familiar with the phrase of the other is non-English in race and in habit. So this was someone who dresses differently, speaks differently, or has different behaviors than a typical, or I should say a stereotypical English person. So they may not actually be from a colony, but they still present a threat of invasion. So invasion here is this feeling of being taken over, the inability to control one's self-will, of becoming less English, or of England losing control of that power. So if you're familiar with the story of Dracula, I'm going to assume most of you are. If not, look it up very quickly. Dracula is the most famous example. He's non-English, he comes in from outside, and in this case, literally, as a vampire, takes over the physical body of English women in particular, sucking out their blood and turning them into something other. So this is reverse colonialization, that a foreign influence would infiltrate England and take away its power and its innocence in the case of women and turn them into something other that's not recognizable. So that is the most famous example of a reverse colonialization novel. But what you're going to see in The Mark of the Beast is that there's a very similar structure to it, where this location is outside England and this reverse colonialization is happening. So a lot of the symbolism of the story is actually put in the context of this type of literature. So let's take a look now at The Mark of the Beast. This story was written by Rudyard Kipling, who is most famous for writing the Jungle Book stories, which have now been turned into Disney films. So that's kind of what he's remembered for now. At the time of the Victorian era, he actually was celebrated because he supported, through his writings, a lot of the colonialist project. He was born in India himself as a British citizen, and he really wrote a lot about British soldiers and life and sort of celebrated what colonialism was. And for that reason, he went out of favor through the first half of the 20th century, because there was this backlash against colonialism, of course, as people started to see all of the negative things that had been done. And as people started to speak out of those colonialist countries that had been colonized, asking for independence, asking for people to reassess what England had done in these places. Kipling has now been brought back as a figure of study because people see more ambiguity in his work, that perhaps maybe he wasn't actually fully celebrating colonialism and all its, different problems, that he sort of, I think people thought maybe he was sweeping those under the rug a little bit, but that maybe he's actually trying to tell stories about the complications of colonialism in ways that are more nuanced. So I want you to think of that context as you look back on your reading of this story and ask whether or not you would see this story as maybe supporting colonialism and its projects, or actually critiquing it in some ways. I think this is a story that really shows us well that Kipling had some more nuance to what he was trying to say about what England was doing in India. But there's still a lot of controversy surrounding him as a literary figure, despite the fact that he won the Nobel Prize for Literature in the early 20th century. So he is a figure that's a little disputed in terms of the quality of his work and what he was really trying to say. So, this particular story starts out by pointing out that it takes place outside of England. So, the narrator tells us that the English god, who is the ultimate supernatural authority, doesn't have jurisdiction in India. So, the events of the story then are placed outside of the normal boundaries of the expected. And what this does for readers is that it immediately positions India and its culture as other compared to English experiences. And that makes sense in the context of having the narrator be realistic to the way that people would have thought during that particular time period. So automatically, we're not in England anymore, so we're not under the same rules as England, is what the narrator is trying to convey to us. He's also going to appeal to the testimony of his friends. You'll see that in the opening, a policeman and a doctor. What this does is establish for readers that he's trying to tell you that this is a true story. So even though it's going to go on to describe how the supernatural really happens, even though this is not a ghost story at all, what he's trying to show you is that there is a reality here and that he wants to be believed, even though he's had this strange supernatural experience. I also want to call your attention in the opening to the part where the party is described, where Fleet gets very, very drunk. The narrator explains how all of the soldiers had this moment together, regardless of rank. They're all just kind of in it together, celebrating, and then they all go their separate ways to do this work of empire building. It's what's described there, conquering, and some people died and some people got married, and there's all this different, lives that happened through this discussion of how the empire is being built. But what you'll notice is that the actual details of the deaths of non-British citizens and the devastation of cultures that's happening through this colonial project, they're not part of the story. These things are alluded to, but they're not explored. They're not directly criticized. Instead, we get this supernatural story that puts into play the symbolism of colonialism in supernatural terms instead of the reality of colonialism in terms of social realism. So Kipling could have written a realist story that dealt with the problems of colonialism, but he chose not to. He chose to write this strange supernatural story where, again, what you've read, the English come out on top in some ways. There's some ambiguity about it, which we can talk about, but this kind of contrast between what happens with the British justice versus what happens with Indigenous justice, these things are kind of left unexplored, right? There's not really a lot of detail given here or a lot of consideration given to what's happening in terms of colonialism. So also I want to mention that we read about Fleet's desecration of the Indian god's image, and I want you to consider that symbolism in that particular moment when a drunk Englishman is coming blundering into this sacred space, basically calling their god a type of pillow, right? He says, "Oh, he's good to rest my head on," and then he puts out his cigar or his cigarette on the forehead of the image. The narrator is describing how he and his friend Strickland realize that this is offensive, right? They pull him out of there. They're like, no, we shouldn't do this. Strickland in particular is worried about the reaction, but they're also thinking of it in British terms, right? They're thinking we've got to figure out how to resolve this in terms of the penal code. That would be the British colonial system that's been brought in and established as the way for things to be redressed between the British and the indigenous people. And this really contrasts with the idea of indigenous justice and what happens to Fleet, which is basically that he's cursed, right? So there's this difference between the way that they are thinking and the way that Native people are thinking. And again, we're seeing that contrast between the colonialist project, that there can't be an equal language or an equal political system, but that the narrator is sort of positioning things in terms of their difference and that othering moment that I talked about earlier. So even though we have these othering moments between the British and the Indian cultures, as the story progresses, we actually realize that Fleet is being turned into a beast after being bitten by the Silver Man. So the narrator at first thinks it's rabies, but he can't say so because he says he knows it's not true. He wants to hope that maybe it's just rabies, but he actually knows that it's something supernatural. He says the affair was beyond any human and rational experience. So what we have here is that moment where we've entered into the supernatural. And that othering then has become focused on Fleet, the Englishman, rather than on the Indian culture. And what we see then is this reverse colonization symbolized, where the other, original other, in the case of the Silverman, has invaded Fleet's physical body, just as the English have invaded and overtaken India. That's where this anxiety and a fear comes from. Just as in a traditional story, you have that sense of anxiety, but here it's been displaced into a supernatural experience that really relies on the cultural context of the reader. So that thrill of the taboo other is providing that anxiety and also the pleasure. There's this threat of being invaded, which is manipulated and marketed through the publication of the story, but it lacks the reality of actual colonization and all of its problems. It's turned into a narrative that's sensational and supernatural and is not really asking readers to consider the real problems of the empire and the real problems of oppressed citizens. Instead, it's entertaining, right? It's scary, but then at the end, we can put it away and it's okay. I want to just point out a couple of moments that I think are important within the story for us to consider. First of all, Fleet becomes an it in the middle of the story. I don't know if you saw that in the change in the language, but the narrator actually stops referring to Fleet as him and he and starts calling him it. At this moment, he's really no longer human. So what Strickland does is take the law into his own hands, right? He says this is what he's going to do. Instead of operating within acceptable British law, he actually is going to resort to torture of the Silverman in order to restore Fleet's soul. And he's going to do this because he's justifying that he wants to save his English friend, despite the fact that Fleet possibly deserves some sort of punishment for his desecration. Again, consider the symbolism of this moment, that an English life, Fleet's life, is worth more than the Silverman's life, a native person's life. Essentially, Strickland is saying torture is unfortunate, but hey, it's acceptable to him, right? If there's no other way to get what I want, I'm going to do this because this life, Fleet's life, is worth more. The realism in the story is also something that I want you to note. Not just the supernatural, and again, Fleet is turning into this beast, and he has that mark on his chest where the Silverman has pressed his head to him. That supernatural moment is played up in the way that Fleet acts and the fact that he starts losing himself to this beast. But I also want you to think about the way that the realism is present in the novel, particularly in the intentional silences of the narrative. A couple of times the narrator says things like, several other things happened that can't be put down here, and this part is not to be printed. So those two phrases evoke even more realistic horrors that are happening, but that aren't recorded on the page. So those silences then and those implications of torture are really present in the narrative, causing another level of anxiety and fear when they're placed alongside the realistic details about the tools that are used for torture and then these supernatural images of Fleet as the beast. So when you put those two things together, that supernatural with the realism, what you have is a story that's really more in the genre of what we now call magical realism. That category didn't exist in the Victorian time period. But basically what magical realism is when the supernatural happens in a very highly realistic situation, and that people in the story just go with it, right? They're not totally freaked out by the supernatural. They're just going to kind of live and go along with it and see what happens. And in this case, Strickland and the narrator, they want to get rid of what's happening to Fleet, but they're not really investigating how it happened, right? They're just accepting a supernatural event. That puts it in the realm of more magical realism. But that realisticness is still grounding the story and actually playing up the horror element to it. And you even have that sort of strange questioning moment that is contrasted with realism when Strickland asks the narrator, "Do you believe that we are awake?" And the narrator says the gun on the floor, the smell was entirely real. So evoking even a smell of torture there is supposed to be horrifying to readers and ground you back into the realism of the situation. So all of these things are in play between the fantasy and the realism, driving that sense of tension and anxiety forward. I also want to ask the question, how complicit are readers? You have the narrator use this phrase, I could understand how men, women, and children could watch a witch burned. He's really horrified by Fleet and by the Silverman, by this supernatural thing that is happening that is turning them into others, right? Even though they are people, they are still human beings. What happens is the narrator begins to see the Silverman as not human and can imagine how others would also dehumanize people in order to justify killing what terrifies them. So this is just a very small aside that he says about, I can understand how people could watch a witch being burned. But I want you to think about that in the terms of the larger colonialist reading of this story. That there is this moment where the narrator seems to be saying, I understand how people destroy others that aren't similar to them because of that fear, right? That there's this fear that's underlying that relationship and that they can't see that person as being human, and that terrifies them, and that then leads them to treat them and to dehumanize them in many ways. So you have these little small moments that I think are pressing back against just a total full-on acceptance and support of colonialism, and asking us to think about the problems of people who are in it, right, who are involved in it, and how they are trying to approach others, and really asking the reader, are you at that point? Do you dehumanize other people? Are you complicit in this moment of torture because you're reading about it? And how are you reacting to this colonialist moment, even though it's put in supernatural terms? So as we get to the end of the story, then, Strickland tries to apologize to the native people about what happened with Fleet, but he's never told anything clear, right? They basically say it never happened. We don't even know what you're talking about. And the narrator quotes from Hamlet, there are more things in heaven and earth. This is emphasizing again that we can never rule out the supernatural. What the narrator is saying is there are more things than we can understand, right? It doesn't have to always be a realistic explanation to what happened when the Silverman held him, and what happened to Fleet and how they got his soul back. We don't really know, and we're probably not going to know. And the last line is really this kind of ironic moment, because he's publishing the story knowing that he won't be believed, because in England, everyone thinks that their God is superior to any others. So the very notion that the events of the story could have happened would be seen as fake. People would automatically reject it because they would say, that's not possible, right? It's not possible for that to happen because England is superior. And again, this calls up this issue of the colonialist project. It's not possible for England to be overwhelmed by someone else. England is the most superior. It's not possible. But in fact, what we know from reading this testimony of this story is that it did in fact happened. It is possible. England can be overwhelmed. There are other rules that are operating. There are other cultural norms that are not British norms. And there are consequences for the colonialist project, both for Fleet, who somehow has this consequence but then escapes and doesn't even remember it and kind of gets off really free from it, and the bigger consequence of Strickland and the narrator not ever being able to forget it. They are marked themselves by this moment. So that mark of the beast takes on this larger resonance as a title that is really the mark of colonialism on both the English, or rather the native people that are losing their culture, but also on Strickland and the narrator themselves, that they can never rid themselves of this mark that has made them do something they feel that is not appropriately English, right? I think we could really put it in other terms as they chose to do something in order to try to protect England that they know was wrong, right? They know and understand that that torture of the Silverman was wrong, but they did it because they felt like they had to protect Fleet, even though Fleet representing England here was wrong to begin with, right? So there's lots of layers of colonialism happening in this story and lots of symbolism about what the mark is and who is it marking. And really, by the time you get into the end of the story, you have those literal physical marks, but you also have the spiritual marking as well of the colonialist project at large. So the complication then and the ambiguity of at the end of it, I think, allows Kipling to kind of play with some of these anxieties. And we have to ask ourselves at the end of it, are we complicit as readers? Did we just read it for sensation? Did we enjoy that anxiety and the strangeness of it, and then we walk away from it? Or are we able to see it as a larger cultural critique, doing, again, more cultural work for readers and for us, asking us to consider the complications of colonial projects and to really carry with us that story that could then ask us to be more considerate of situations like this in the future. So there's, I think, for me, a little more on the latter side, that I think this story is more nuanced and more complicated than just a typical scary story that ends and goes away. I think Kipling is trying to do a deeper level of cultural work and to ask his readers and to ask us to really consider the complications of this situation and not take it at face value. So in conclusion then, when we're thinking about the Victorian supernatural, I want you to remember that typically ghost stories or supernatural stories were an escape from reality and the everyday. They're really going to place responsibility for problems outside of readers' control because the main pleasure of the story is the thrill of something beyond the everyday. But it's also thrilling not to feel responsible for things, to just be able to relax and enjoy the fantasy of it, even enjoy being scared by it, but then just be able to close the book or the newspaper where you read it and say, that was a nice story. I enjoyed that moment. They are really not asking readers typically to think very much beyond that moment of entertainment. They are, again, a type of fantasy that's fully in the marvelous. The conclusion of these types of stories affirms that there is no natural explanation for the events. So compare that to detective fiction, where all mysteries have a rational explanation. These stories are the opposite extreme. If there's any sense of suspense or moments of the fantastique where we're not sure, they're going to resolve into the marvelous. Their pleasure is also coming from an opposite place: escape and aesthetic experience, not truth and provable scientific type of facts. But I also want you to remember that, as we have seen, some authors complicated the use of the supernatural to play on cultural anxieties. They use the supernatural for ambiguity and to ask readers to question perceived moral authorities like those of colonialism and the colonialist project. So while there were, typically going to be entertaining, typically going to be fully in the marvelous and just giving the feelings and the pleasure of escaping the everyday, you still do have authors that are going to take those supernatural motifs and use them for more social purposes. So they're not completely always going to be separate. Sometimes you're going to have that blend, and it really will depend on the author's purpose. So just keep that in mind as you continue to read. Thanks.